If you're like me, a first generation woman, you've probably struggled with the fear of judgment. I know it's so hard to drown out all the noise. You're going to get judged, you're going to do something wrong, you're going to be criticized, and ultimately decide what's right for you or even know what's right for you. In this video, I'm going to give you some concrete ideas to help you learn to overcome this fear of judgment. All right, let's jump in. So ultimately, this fear of judgment is when you're concerned, you think, you ruminate, you worry about what other people in your life are going to say about your decisions. And this can keep you really stuck, especially as a first generation woman. Maybe there's certain kind of stereotypes or models that you saw growing up that there's this expectation, implicit or explicit, that you're supposed to follow, right? Marry, have kids, take care of your family, don't go against the grain, be a good girl, right? All these things that maybe culturally you've seen very explicit messages, or maybe you've just seen modeled through your life. And so there's this fear that if you go outside of that box, you're going to be judged or criticized. And this fear of judgment ultimately can lead you to make decisions that aren't really based on you, but based on just avoiding this criticism, which makes sense, right? Because obviously, if you've had this experience where either you've been criticized or you've seen other people in your culture or family be criticized when they go outside of the box, that you want to avoid that at all cost. But this can really lead to you doing things that really aren't right for you. So like some examples that come to mind. Following certain cultural or religious beliefs. So for instance, let's say you're going to get married and your parents really need you to get married, have a religious Catholic church, and that's really important to them, but that's not really important to you or your partner. And so you kind of struggle with that, and ultimately you just give in. And ultimately, it's not about the fact that you give in, it's about why you give in, and that's really important. This can show up about other important decisions, like whether you want to be a parent. Specifically for a woman, I think that's really hard in certain cultures. If you say you want to be childless by choice, right? This fear that you're going to get a lot of pushback, right? And then even if you become a parent, right? If you're a mother, it's like you can never get it right. There's certain ways you should parent. And if you're not doing that, I think especially nowadays, if your family or culture was raised one way and now let's say you're trying to raise your kid, like homeschool them or gentle parenting, and then you get a lot of pushback, like that's not what you're doing. You're just spoiling your kids. You're being too soft, whatever the case is, it's that you can just get a lot of criticism for how you decide to show up. What really manifests in terms of your emotional toll is anxiety, self-doubt, perfectionism, really making decisions that aren't in alignment with your values, right? Just to please. So anything you do to avoid, maybe a lot of overthinking things because you just want to make sure you get it right to avoid that criticism. And that can just be really exhausting, especially kind of that anxiety and thinking about it, or even to a certain degree, I see a lot of perfectionism, right? Needing to just get it right, or maybe people pleasing and conforming just to make sure you don't get any of that pushback. And again, there's kind of that sense of like, ugh, that's just not what I wanted to do. I just like gave in, which can lead to resentment towards certain people in your family or culture. Okay, so this first tip is really understand the impact that this has on your life and how it makes sense. So what I mean is that really start to understand that there's these cultural pressures and expectations, especially as a first generation or second generation woman, that you're up against. It's not just you're not doing something wrong, you're not just the one that only gets criticized, or the fact that you care so much, again, it doesn't make you unique. It just means that you're human and that there's certain kind of things at play here culturally that you're up against. And that's really important to understand, so that when you start to face a challenge, or when you notice, oh, I'm doing that thing again, where I'm like so compelled to just like conform or avoid a confrontation or just give in to maybe what a parent wants just to avoid. And instead of kind of being really harsh with yourself, like start to ask yourself, like, how does this challenge make sense based on my upbringing, right? And you're going to find an answer, because probably you've had an experience of even being judged harshly or seeing it, or you just know there's a dynamic in your family that you just don't do that, or it takes a lot of work to get you to change. So ultimately, once you can start to understand that it's not just you, there's certain other factors at play, and have a little bit more kind of compassion, and ultimately practice radical acceptance for it. And when I say radical acceptance, I'm not saying that you're not going to still do the things and change, but ultimately I want you to accept that there's certain things that are outside of your control, or certain cultural elements that are at play here. This next one is about identifying your fear triggers. So start to dig a little bit deeper. So start to understand, what are the specific instances that bring on this fear of being judged? Is it across the board, or is it very specific areas? Are you concerned about being judged as a parent, or about your career, about your appearance? Whatever the case is, I just want you to start to get really curious, because the more you can start to get curious, you can start to plan ahead. So if you know, man, I know every single time I go to Christmas that I'm going to be judged on my parenting, right? Then you can start to get really prepared. How do you want to respond to that comment from your mother or your mother-in-law while honoring yourself, but potentially really still honoring the relationship if that's what's important to you. Ultimately, the more you can get ahead of this fear and plan ahead, then you have a better shot of doing something different. If you're not sure, a good place to start is just to start logging this, to start noticing, like, okay, what are the instances where I notice I have this big emotional response, or I get really stuck, or my anxiety really starts to show up? Think about like the last month and think about, like, man, what were the instances that come to mind? And if nothing comes to mind, start today and just kind of, on your notes app or pull up a journal page and start to kind of start jotting down moving forward, like, oh man, I noticed this is the instance when I got stuck, and get really curious. What were the factors at play, and ultimately what showed up for you and how you responded? This next one is more of a mindset shift. It's really starting to give yourself permission to make decisions that are right for you, not just to avoid this fear of judgment or just to conform to certain cultural or family expectations or norms. And I know this might feel like blasphemy, but you don't actually owe your parents anything. They brought you into this world, not the other way around. And I'm not saying this from an attitude of entitlement or not being grateful, but especially I find this a lot with people that then become parents, that the expectation that they have for their kids is much different than maybe the expectations that their family have for them. And it really helps them to start to shift this perspective. If they wouldn't expect this of their kids, why do their parents expect it of them? And culturally, that might be very normal, but it's this permission to start to break out of these cultural norms if they're no longer working for you or serving you. And this again might feel like, oh, this is a really hard work to start to break free from these cultural norms. And I also want you to start realizing the cost to you. And that's really important. So the more you can start to give yourself permission to live your life based on what you want, not necessarily just to conform or please, the more you can start to embody this, like being able to say no, or being able to set limits, or being able to be comfortable with the fact that someone might judge you and how you're going to respond in that moment. This next one is all about being able to practice being with the emotional discomfort. So this is really when we're going to tap into any tool that's going to help you regulate your emotions. I'm also thinking very specifically of being able to deal with like shame and shame resiliency, because I find that's a common theme, especially for first generation women, when they start to make decisions for them and they're going against maybe these family norms. They start to feel like, oh my gosh, I'm not a good child, I'm not a good daughter, I can't believe I'm doing this. So a lot of shame and insecurity. So really practicing those shame resiliency skills. So I'm thinking here of kind of the work of Brene Brown, and like being able to move through that shame storm and not just get stuck in secrecy or fostering or believing all those shaming messages, but really kind of leaning into like how you can practice vulnerability, or who's your support system, or even how you can be present with this experience without getting stuck in the shame cycle. So shame is one example, but it can be practice being with the discomfort of the anxiety or the fear, or what shows up in the moment, so you can start to get really good at like, okay, this is the pain that shows up and this makes sense to me, but I don't have to let this pain dictate my life or my actions. This next one is all about painting and visualizing what success looks like when it comes to fear of judgment. So thinking about like do some mindfulness practices, imagining like what would your life look like if you weren't so concerned about being judged? How would that impact your day to day? Like paint a picture out in your mind. What would be different? What would it feel like? Again, even if you have to deal with that initial discomfort, but what would it feel like to wake up knowing that you've made decisions that are right for you, not just to avoid this fear of judgment? And once you really paint that picture and sit with it and do it multiple times, right? Really get good to the point where you can kind of know, what is it about this picture that's really kind of motivating for you? Why is it important? And then I want you to start to think about, what are tiny, tiny, tiny little changes you can start to do to help you achieve that picture, right? I'm not saying tackle these huge things. I'm thinking like tiny things, right? So even if that's like, I'm going to make a decision about my parenting and I'm not even going to tell my parents, and that's totally okay. Or if they make a comment, I'm just going to be comfortable with that discomfort. Maybe I'm not ready to set a boundary and say something, but maybe it's more of that practice that I'm not going to let it get me so stuck and consumed, right? So think about what those tiny, tiny little changes could look like. If you need help with these tiny changes, whether it's more support, accountability, more tools, or maybe not seeing those stuck places, then here at Nurturing Wellness Collective, I work with first and second generation women. I empower them to reclaim their true self, to really make these important life changes. Work with me one-on-one with some coaching to really help you get there. Check out my website below to see how you can schedule a free consult call. All right, guys, and like I always say, I encourage you to continue nurturing your mind, body, and soul, whatever that looks like for you. Thanks.